and we are a test centre for wave and tidal energy devices. And the question was asked about what they look like, and indeed this is one of the machines that's behind me now by a company called Open Hydro, who had this device up in our site doing testing. But what I want to talk to you about this evening is a little bit about what's happening in Orkney as a whole, because I think there are quite a lot of lessons to be learnt from what we're doing as a small community of about 20,000 people. And I think there are pieces that are probably applicable and lessons to learn. And indeed, if this builds some bridges and we can help you with some of the things that you're going to be grappling with, then we'd be very happy to do so. And similarly, at a later date, I'm sure you'll find your way through some of the briar patch that we're all in terms of dealing with environmental issues and climate change. So I'll get into the presentation as a whole. As Dom said, there's happy to take questions as we go. And make sure I get the right screen up. There we go. Excellent. Just minimize this so I'm going to get the minimum distractions on the screen. So hopefully, if somebody can give me a thumbs up, Dom, could you give me a thumbs up if you're seeing the energy of Orkney? Excellent, fantastic. So what I want to talk to you tonight about is what's going on up in Orkney as a whole. And for those of you who don't know where Orkney is, we're at 59 degrees north. We're nearer Bergen than we are London. And if you know about Orkney and you know anything about the place, you probably think of it as, you know, beautiful scenery, archaeological remains, nice little towns next to the water, beautiful sunsets. But what people often don't think of are some of the pieces that are going on in terms of technology that's moving on. So we have quite an active fleet of vessels that are out deploying things in the sea. The vessel in the top right hand corner is a tidal turbine, which I'll talk more about that later on. And bottom left is an electrolyzer producing hydrogen. So we are using spare electricity to produce hydrogen. And in the bottom right, we're trying to build high quality housing with built-in renewables that are very, very low energy. So energy is a real thing for us here in these islands, and it's a significant part of what the island does. And there are a number of reasons why, which I'll talk about later. The islands themselves are very fortunately placed, and as a result of that, we get strong winds. Goodness knows we get strong winds. We had 130-mile-an-hour winds last year. We also have nothing between us and Canada, so the waves that come across the North Atlantic pound into our coast. And on our wave test site, which is on the left-hand side, shown by the little blue diamond on the left-hand side, we measured 17-meter high waves on our site a couple of years ago. So we get strong waves. We also get strong tides because the water on either side of the UK is out of phase with each other and tries to rush from the North Atlantic into the North Sea and then back again on a regular basis. And we get caught in the wash between the two as it roars around the top. So we get very strong tides. And overall, it's been realized that there's a significant amount of energy, and this slide I'm using is actually now quite out of date, because at that time we reckon we had around about 5,000 megawatts of generating potential. And just give you some context, the UK is using about 50 megawatts of, sorry, 50 so 5,000 megawatts, so 50,000 megawatts or 50 gigawatts of electricity at the moment. So 10% of the UK's electricity demand could be met from resources here. However, there's some work just going on now which is looking to put a lot more offshore wind out to sea than we anticipated. So instead of it being the 5 gigawatts, we estimate it's now something like 20 gigawatts of energy that's likely to be incident in this area. So there's a lot going on in the energy space as a whole. And one of the things with Orkney is that we think we're seeing something of the energy system that everybody's going to face in the future. So we're involved in a project called the Reflex project, which is trying to help put storage into the electricity system. And one of the partners involved in it did some work a little while ago, and they looked at the UK electricity picture. And so the grey squiggle in the middle is the electricity demand on the network during August 2019 over the 31 days of August. And the green line below it is what was generated from renewables in 2019. And so we thought, well, wonder what will happen if you simply increase the renewables. So by quadrupling the amount of renewables on the network, you end up with this picture. In other words, you end up with a picture where you are ending up with renewables more than you need on occasions, and sometimes when there are gaps below them. There are gaps and we're not generating enough. And the spikes are principally solar, and the waveform is principally wind. So there's the changing weather patterns created that waveform, and then the spikes is really solar. But in Orkney today, this is our picture. This was a couple of months ago, or a couple of years ago. But in effect, it is showing the same sort of picture that the UK will have if it simply quadruples the amount of electricity that it generates from renewables. So the point is, we are seeing some of the challenges that we think the rest of the UK is going to be facing over time. So Orkney's been grappling with energy for a long time, and the wave and tidal side of things that we're working on is a part of it, but there's a lot more that's been going on, because from an energy achievements point of view, we've generated more than we've needed in terms of electricity from renewables every year since 2013, principally onshore wind. We've also had more wave and tidal devices deployed at our sites than anywhere else in the world. And now a lot of places, like myself, we actually make our own power from microgeneration. So we have solar and wind, and roughly about 1 in 10 of the houses in Orkney is making their own power. We've embraced electric vehicles. We were the highest EV'd up area in Scotland, but we're now third. But we think that's actually probably because a lot of the lease companies are based in a couple of areas that are eclipsing us at the moment. As I said earlier, we're also doing work and piloting work with using hydrogen in ferries, and that hydrogen is being produced from renewables rather than split out from methane. And we've also been pioneering some new grid technologies which allow the grid to be more sensitive to the needs and the renewables that are around. But I have to say, it's not all sweetness and light, because we do pay more for our power than anywhere else, mainly because it's a long way up country, and there seems to be a very London-centric view, which is based on the fact that the further you are away from London, the more you seem to pay for your power, even though we're making our own, which is slightly galling to say the least. But we also know we've got problems going on with, this is the CO2 levels in the atmosphere effectively over my lifetime. And we are now at over 410 parts per million. And this has to stop, because if we don't stop this, it will stop us. And also mentioning the high costs of electricity and fuel as a whole, we've got the highest levels of fuel poverty in Scotland, i.e. people are spending more than 10% of their disposable income on fuel, and it's something between about 30 and 40%, I believe, in some areas. So we've got some issues, so it's not absolutely perfect. But Orkney's been at this energy thing for quite a long time. We originally had a lot of windmills. We had the UK's first grid-connected aero generator, as it was called in those days, back in the 50s. It blew down in the hurricane that caused the big storm surge. And we did other work in the 1980s. In addition, we've got an oil terminal here, which has taken 10% of the UK's oil. And we did have the world's largest wind turbine at one point, which was a 3-meter concrete tower, which was then subsequently felled some years later because it became unsafe. But it was a huge technical jump. We do have very high CO2 emissions because of our ferries and things. I'll talk about that in a second. And as a result of all of this lot, a renewable energy forum was created, which I'm one of the board members of OREF. And that, frankly, has been a huge unifying force. And this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you today, is that I believe these community groups are fundamental in helping to deliver renewables when the moment comes, because you need the means to talk to each other. And in sort of 2000 onwards, the organisation I run was set up, and we also pushed on with a lot of wind development. Sorry, the islands pushed on with a lot of wind development. As I said earlier, we became a net electricity supporter in 2013. So one of the challenges we faced was understanding what is actually going on with our energy system as a whole. And as part of the project that I mentioned earlier that we're undertaking, the Reflex project, which is funded by UK government, an energy audit was undertaken. And that energy audit was a repeat of one done in 2013, and it's allowed us to understand the ways in which energy is being used in some detail. And this is once again an item that is fundamentally important to getting on top of your energy picture. You need to know what you're doing now rather than what you think you're doing. So this graph, this Sankey diagram, the breadth of the line is relative. So the breadth gives you a magnitude of the amount of the energy that's used. And you can see here in the top that we're using a lot of our energy in buildings, and then below that road transport, marine transport, industry, etc., etc. And we have also split this out in great detail to the fuels in terms of the transport side of things, the blue bit in the middle. And we know what we're using in different types of vehicles. And you can see there's a barely perceptible line for electric vehicles and a much thicker line for diesels, and then slightly thinner line for diesel LGVs, light goods vehicles. The point being, we can see what we're doing, and this allows us to target a couple of areas, and I'm going to talk more about a couple of things that are going on here. But the point is, you notice that heat and light at the top right hand corner is of reasonable size, but transport is of a comparable scale, and our ferries at the bottom, i.e. the green bit at the bottom, you see the width of that line is pretty similar. Or sorry, the blue, dark blue slab towards the bottom, the ferry services to the mainland and inter-island ferries. This lot together is pretty similar to what we're using for our heating and lighting our properties. So ferries are a thing here, and this is a big piece of what we've been doing. We've also been working a lot on the smart grid, and we do have a means by which the local electricity company is monitoring the use of the grid and is then displaying that information, and this is how we know our energy picture overall. And over time, we know things have changed. And this is a time series going back to 2003 through to 2013, I think it is. And each of those dots is a day. And a red dot means we imported electricity, and a green dot means we exported it. We're a net exporter of electricity. And you can see the change that's gone on over time. So my point is, this is not a quick fix. This is something that takes time and takes concerted application by a committed group of people over an extended period. We've also seen a lot of people locally have taken up microgeneration with domestic turbines. That's actually the one in my garden. And we've now got 1/9 of the UK's domestic wind turbines, and they're bringing around about £4 million into the economy through feed-in tariffs, etc. And this means it's reducing money that's lost. Otherwise, if we pay money to an electricity company locally, 98 pence of every pound basically leaves the county. So if we can circularize our spending by giving the money to the people who are generating locally, and those generating assets are owned locally, then we reduce the hemorrhaging of cash from the local economy. But we do know that small wind is squeezing some of the more efficient wind off, and we also know how well these turbines are performing because we run a database which keeps track of exactly what is happening on a continuous basis. And that allows us to see not only how well the turbines generate, but also allows us to see what happens when government policy changes. And the steps in the line in the bottom left-hand side are directly related to changes in government policy when feed-in tariffs, etc., were wiped out and effectively flattened the growth of renewables. We also know a lot of what's going on in the community as a whole about the wealth distribution, because we know that there are around 300 people employed in the renewable sector, 750 turbines in domestic, to solar of 400 or so, 300 electric cars. So all in all, we reckon about 2,000 households have a direct benefit or a link to renewables out of about 10,000 households on the islands. So as I say, energy is a thing here. It's hard to have hard to go to the local co-op and not have a conversation about energy in one way or another, much to my wife's disgust. However, so this is a bit about the energy picture as a whole. I said I'd talk a little bit about what's happening with marine renewables, and I did want to talk to you about one particular company that's been a great success, because we have tested a number of turbines on our site, and the one I wanted to talk to you about, there've been something like, I think, 30 machines tested in total, but I'll tell you about one in particular by a company called Orbital Marine Power. Now, Orbital Marine Power used to be called Scott Renewables, and they turned up first of all with a small turbine that was just a test. And this was an idea dreamt up by a local guy who went to the local university here and came up with an idea. Now, this came on a boat trailer, effectively, and it was just to prove the concept. Now, hanging underneath this turbine underneath the hull are a couple of turbines which turn in the water, and I'm going to leave a a link in the chat, and I'll send it to Dom, which is a really good video made by the present managing director showing what's going on, and I'll leave you with that later on. But they went from this initial turbine to a 250 kilowatt machine, which is being tested here under tow. And then eventually they went to the machine I showed you a little bit about earlier, which is a 2 megawatt machine. And you can see the two people standing on the back of it here. This machine, as I say, has got rotors that hang down underneath, and as the tide passes, so the rotors turn. That machine is actually stationary in the water. That bow wave is caused by the water going past the machine, not the machine going through the water. And that was very successful in 2018, and they actually generated 7% of Orkney's electricity week in, week out over an extended period. And as a result of that, they're now building the next machine, which is in fabrication in Dundee, and that's covered in the little video I'll leave you with and I urge you to have a look at later, because I find it really quite inspiring. As I said, we've had something like 30 different machines in the water from 19 different developers from 10 different countries, and there's been a great variety of things that have gone on. The work that EMEC has done we were created in order to bring these machines to get into the water, either as tidal machines or wave machines. And overall, we know we've added nearly £300 million gross value added to the UK economy as a result of doing this work. And we fundamentally believe, from the modelling we've done, that tidal energy and wave energy could be a significant generator of electricity for the country. Estimates are it could do around about 20% of the UK's present electricity demand, and that's comparable to what nuclear is doing at the moment. But we need to get the technology to work, and the technology is starting to work, but it is a long haul, and we shouldn't consider this is just a 5-minute job. I'll happily talk more about some of those machines later on, but fundamentally, there's some very good information on the EMEC website, and it shows how the different machines work. And I didn't want to use up all our time this evening, me getting into deep and technical detail, because it would bore the living daylights out of everybody. So a little bit about what's happening, why Orkney's made a bit of progress in the renewable space, and it's really because like anywhere, there are the three different sectors of the public and private and third sector. And as I mentioned earlier, OREF exists, and that is a really good forum for allowing these different groups to speak together. And so I really do commend you having the group, the other group at all, because that really is fundamental to us, the success that we've had to date. It's allowed developers to come and talk to the supply chain, and the supply chain are real people here doing real work and making real investments in boats and actually seeing infrastructure built that allows machines to be installed. This is an old naval base that was cannibalized and then has been remodeled in order to help renewables happen. So we're seeing investment happen in the renewable space as a result of all of the work that has gone on in trying to promote marine renewables as a whole. So the supply chain works because it actually involves, say, jobs being created in these often remote and fragile coastal communities. The work that is done is quite interesting. It fits quite well with tourism on occasions because people are interested in this stuff. It also fits quite well with fishing, because in times when people are unable to fish, they can go out and do other things. It works really well for people who want their children to go into marine industries, because there is a new industry to go in, not just a decreasing pool of increasingly industrialized fishing. So for us, we find it really works, and it's been accepted by the local community as a new way to generate wealth from the sea. And a lot of money's actually been spent in doing this, getting the marine renewables to happen. These are millions of pounds that in the links, in the little numbers in the corner. But the interesting point is the two extracted segments at the top are monies which we reckon Orkney has actually put into this. So there's government money gone into making this work, there's European money, there's been Scottish money, but the local community has also made significant investments in vessels and making things happen. So the point is, it's an engaged community that wants to make things happen. In terms of our energy as a whole, we do actually have an energy strategy. and the Sustainable Energy Strategy was produced in 2017 and by the local council, but it was produced with a lot of input through local organisations, including OREF and the general public. And one of the interesting points that it contains is there being a target setting process of working out what we need to do, and we know we have to get to carbon free by 2050-ish, pick your date around there. But the point is that we're not going to go from one to the other in one jump. You know, that we have to, there is a journey, and we can't just wait until 2049 and go, right, okay, decarbonize tomorrow then. So we have to get on this journey. In addition, there have to be some communities that are going to have to move earlier than others in order to learn how to do this and to share with others the scar tissue and the lessons learned from the whole process. So we are pushing on really hard to be something of a pathfinder in some of this activity, and so that's why we're interested in talking to other groups, because you may find ways that can help us deliver on what we're trying to do, just as we're happy to share what's going on. But these are big and challenging targets, and we need to recognize that this is going to be a hell of a journey. So one of the things we have been tackling, and if you think back to the Sankey diagram with the lines across it about transport, those blue bits in the middle, we've been working really hard about decarbonising transport, and the electrification of transport has been something of a slow success at the moment. These are the numbers of electric vehicles in Orkney quarter by quarter up to 2020, and that represents about 3% of cars at the moment, but we need to push really hard because we've now got around 272 or so electric vehicles plus the 6 buses. I saw another 5 had turned up in the last week or so. We are keen to see ways to make this work. Part of the work we have been doing is publishing a guide on how to build infrastructure, because we saw a number of charge points built really badly, unfortunately by councils who didn't necessarily have experience in doing it. So we've sought to use the knowledge that we've gained and shared that with others about how to do it. As I mentioned earlier, we're the 3rd highest uptake of EVs in Scotland. We now have a second draft of our electric vehicle strategy, which has now been adopted, which is helping everybody focus on how to actually electrify transport. And we've also got bids in for various other low carbon activities which are going on. And we also make the most of the fact of what we've done. And this was the no CO2 message with an exclamation mark we spelt out in cars that we sent to the Rio Earth Summit, the Paris COP talks. However, one of the things that we've also found that's useful is making sure that we understand what's going on. And electric vehicles, this has been really telling. So we've had a database that's been running since the EVs were really introduced here, and we get people voluntarily to send in their mileages every month. We do it through Google Forms, which allows it to be automated, and then we collect the data from, I think it's about 90 of the vehicles at the moment we're collecting data from. And the interesting thing with that is it tells us a lot about what's going on. We know the sorts of cars that are bought, we know whether they are second-hand or being leased, and we know that's changing. A lot more are being leased now. We know where the cars are, but the most interesting thing of all is showing the average distances travelled per month. And people normally say, oh yes, we're on an island, so you can't travel that far. Yes, well, the electric vehicles will be perfect. Well, actually, the average distance travelled by electric vehicles there is greater than the average distance travelled by cars in Scotland. My point is that not many people do the average. A lot of people do a lot less than the average. And if you don't understand the mileage you do, you can't hope to understand whether an electric vehicle is right for you. And our experience is most people have got grossly over-specified vehicles. The distances they travel are usually a fraction of what they expect. So capture the mileage of what people are driving now, and even if normality does return, but capture the mileage of what they're doing so they can understand whether an electric vehicle is of the range they think. Because all the car dealers, and I apologize if there are any in the audience, will try and sell you the same stuff they sold you before, which tends to be internal combustion engines. So I suggest use crowdsourced knowledge about what you actually do to be able to make the judgments that you need to make when you're ready. Something else we're working on really hard is the decarbonisation of heat, because we know that heat is the largest single user that's the Scottish picture, and in our case, transport is slightly bigger in the pie than is shown here. But we have seen the council working really well with both council housing and its stock, and also working with the private developers. And we know that together they're all facing similar challenges, but they need to tackle them all slightly differently, but are able to learn from one another. And we've seen that there are very different drivers for what is going on in different areas, and they'll be different for you, because our average electricity demand is double the UK average. And that's because we don't have gas. So we have to use electricity or coal or peat or something. So we are using a lot more electricity than others, and we know our electricity prices have been higher than elsewhere. And we know that the cost of living on the Scottish Islands is higher, and we also know that fuel poverty is a high issue. And I mentioned that we have no gas. And the point is, this then leads us to understanding how our energy is being used. And once again, if you can understand and audit your own processes, you can understand what you need to tackle. Because we can clearly see that oil is something we need to get rid of. There was a few years ago, the press definitely was to stop people using electric heating because it was seen as very carbon intense, because it was all coming from coal. But now most of it's coming from gas, and the majority in the near future will be coming from renewables. So electric heating is actually good. 10 years ago, it was regarded as bad. So keep up to date with what's happening in the picture. I'm conscious I'm overrunning a little bit, so I'll just catch a couple of pieces of what we are doing about hydrogen. I mentioned we are producing hydrogen from tidal energy, and this really came out of this photograph at the start, which was one of the ferries, of which we have 9 that operate within the islands, and that ferry uses around 16 megawatt hours of diesel a day. And we thought, is there a way in which we can use tidal energy in some form or other? And we looked at using skimming the tops of the tides and storing the energy from the high energy intense periods, storing it as hydrogen, electrolyzing it, and then turning it back into electricity at a later date to give us a uniform resultant output of electricity. That's what we thought we would try. But interestingly, as soon as we started to make hydrogen, we had some piece of work done which showed the value of hydrogen in different forms. And it shows down in the bottom right hand corner that the value of hydrogen turned back into electricity is worth about 30 pence a kilogram. Whereas if you use it for propulsion for fuel cell cars on the extreme left hand side, it's worth about £6.50 a kilogram. So the point is, if you've got hydrogen, you're probably not going to want to turn it back into electricity. My point is, by experimenting and starting to model stuff, we found there were better things to do than our original idea, which was using hydrogen as a store between the tides. So we are now using it more in the middle area. And in fact, we're now, if I get time to show you, we're actually working on a hydrogen fuel cell aircraft rather than necessarily cars, because they probably are now being dealt with by batteries instead. I won't have time to talk through the project we're doing with hydrogen, but in short, we're making hydrogen on the island of Edi by bringing in a community wind turbine as well as our tidal turbines. We're taking the hydrogen down to Kirkwall, which is mainland Orkney, where we're turning the hydrogen into electricity to power ferries when they tie up alongside at night. And this is a thing called the Surf and Turf project, which we are working on. In addition, there's a further project called Big Hit, which is doing something similar on the small island of Shappensea, population about 200, I think, where we're using the hydrogen to fuel a boiler on a school, and also powering some hydrogen fuel cell range extender vans on the mainland as well. So we're doing an awful lot of trying to make these things all fit together. And we do find that we can, as an island community, bring these sort of things together. So here is a group of people at the opening where we are shows how we're transporting the hydrogen. We have storage of gas. We've got a fuel cell. We are using the waste heat for district heating, basically in a small way in that shed. And the ferry is in the process of being converted to actually run on hydrogen as well. So altogether, these things fit, and then that also fits with the vehicles which we are seeing start to be used. Overall, I have to say, I think we're not going to see as much hydrogen vehicles. We're more likely to see hydrogen shipping and heavy stuff in future. And I'm pleased to say this does get attention because this is the Scottish Energy Minister at the opening of the fuel cell. And the final thing I just want to talk about briefly was about the final project I mentioned, which is something we're doing with Zero Avia at Cranfield, and this is a small hydrogen-powered aircraft. In effect, it's a 6-seat aircraft. It has been turned to electric from rather than the internal combustion engine, and they are then replacing the batteries with a fuel cell and hydrogen storage tanks. And in the background, you can see the truck, which was procured by EMEC and contains an electrolyzer and gas storage system, which allows us to make hydrogen in a portable basis. And this has just gone through a process called ADR, which allows it to be used on the roads in the UK. So we're doing some demos with that. Watch the space. They have done their first electric flight on that. They're about to do their first hydrogen flight shortly, and we're looking forward to seeing them do their demo flights in the UK. I'm going to skip over the next one, which is really about priorities, which I'll go through that one. They just really only fit Scotland. But the thing I did want to really show is that we are able to work really closely with government, because we find that there is a national strategy and there is investment coming into the green space now, particularly in the post-COVID Build Back Better economic stimulus side of things. By working together with local democracy and both in the sort of organised but an unorganised form as well, people getting together, it actually allows people to be empowered to actually create change. And we feel that the people in the middle, that local democracy and private enterprise, helps the national strategy engage with the economic potential. So what we found really is that we are in a space where learning by doing is actually critically important, and it needs small communities to show how things work. All ideas start somewhere. They don't have to start in Southwest One. They can start elsewhere, and we have found that we've now gone from working on tidal energy to working in hydrogen, and now we're working in hydrogen on land, sea and air. We are seeking to have practical demonstration, and we are really feeling we're making some progress towards net zero, but we're really interested in ideas, and if people have got other thoughts of what we could be doing or whether we could be working with other people, we'd be delighted to hear from you. That's all I was going to say. Dominic, I will now shut up for a minute. You're pleased to say.
Neil, thank you so much. A brilliant talk. Well done. Now, in terms of questions, do you want? I'll try and unmute everybody so that you can then sort of come in, because I haven't seen very many questions on the chat yet, but okay. Also use the chat. So I'm going to unmute everybody and see if that goes. Any questions?
So I see there was one from Stephen about the Lawrence, which is quite interesting. Yeah, Lawrence is interesting. I went there on holiday when we were kids, and went again sometime later. Lawrence is a barrage across an estuary on the west coast of France, and effectively this was built back in the 70s, I think it was, and effectively it's a hydro scheme, i.e. water falls downhill through a turbine, but in this case it's a salty one, and it's refilled every 6 hours by the tide coming back in. So they built a barrier across a bay, kept the water out, and then they let the water in through turbines on occasions, and it fills up the area inshore. They then stop the turbines, seal the gates, let the tide go out, and when the tide's out, they then open the gates and let the water rush out again. It works. It works very well. It was done in a few different places. It was done in Annapolis Royal in Canada. It was done in Russia. Interestingly, it was done in Elling in Southampton by the Romans as well. So it's an idea that's been around for quite a while. Why didn't it carry on? Well, environmentally, it's a bit of a challenge because the way certainly Lawrence was built, it was a salty estuary, which they built a wall across, and therefore that meant everything inshore of the wall then became freshwater whilst they built the barrier. So it killed everything that was in seawater. They then connected it back to the sea and made it slightly brackish, which then killed everything inshore, which was then which had got used to the freshwater. They haven't necessarily had major sedimentation issues. Interestingly, they have found that the wildlife seems to tolerate it quite well. And I know that certainly in the case in Annapolis Royal, they found there were some seals that had got in through the sluices and stuff, and they were quite worried about them. So they spent a long time catching them, and they put them on a boat and took them out to sea and tossed them back in the sea. And 2 weeks later, they found them back inside again. You know, so the seals did voluntarily seem to want to come in, and there doesn't seem to necessarily have been the same level of ecosystem damage. There was a lot of talk about doing something in the Severn some years ago. In fact, I think the first proposal for the Severn barrage was about 1870. And there's been quite a lot of concern about whether that would be the right thing to do. People once again are worried about damaging the Severn ecosystem, but the information I've seen shows that the Severn ecosystem is pretty poor. There's a lot of wading birds, but the wading birds are having to work very, very hard because there's very little biodiversity in it, because the water is extremely turbid, and there's practically no photosynthesis in the Bristol Channel. So, and we also need to recognise that if we are going to see significant sea level rise, I wonder how we're going to protect most of the Bristol Channel. To my mind, I can see honestly that we could end up having to build the barrage not only for flood defence purposes, but also for generation purposes. And we might end up moving our ports of Bristol to the barrier that's then built out in the middle of the Bristol Channel. You know, there could be some big engineering that's going to be needed, because if we do end up with a sea level change that has been talked about, we are going to need to take some big steps, and these things may well come back, and the comparatively minor damage to some forms of marine life might be grossly eclipsed by the damage we're going to see elsewhere.
Thank you for that, Neil. There was a question from Julian Woods. He's saying there's a lot of concern about the impact of working from home on domestic energy use. How do I persuade my local parish council or unitary authority to generate energy communally?
That's interesting. So the concern about working from home, yeah, we're certainly going to see a change, because people are going to be heating buildings in a way they didn't last winter. But also, we're seeing some interesting things going on with schools, for example, in that to get the ventilation, they're having to leave the windows open. So the schools are trying to heat themselves while keeping the windows open. So I think we're going to see quite a big spike in quite a lot of public buildings heating requirements due to the pretty inadequate ventilation that the UK seems to obsess about. We don't seem to understand how air conditioning works. So I don't know that necessarily working from home is going to see a massive increase in energy. It might see an overall change. National Grid did produce some figures in things called future energy scenarios, and they're well worth looking at if you get a chance to look at them. It's called the FES process they do every year, and that showed there was a drop off in energy, but actually it then came back up again, and it isn't dramatically different at the moment than that which we saw this time last year, I think. In terms of getting the council to produce local energy, I would suggest the main thing is getting public engagement in it, because it's quite easy for people to object to somebody else's energy scheme, much harder to object to your own. So I think if people have a sense of engagement, if you're driving past and you think, how's my pension doing today? I would suggest you're probably going to feel quite differently to it to if it's something that's imposed by somebody else. That's certainly what Denmark saw when they created wind saving schemes that allowed people to jointly invest in renewables. And I would suggest that that's probably a key part of it. They could also encourage the planning legislation. And I think there are changes going on in things like the planning process? Permitted development rights, which are allowing more types of renewables and things to be put in, I think. So I think there are changes going on, but I think it's up to us to demand change. I can remember my mother going off on one continuously about satellite dishes and stuff, and then it was about solar panels. Now I'm not sure people even notice solar panels as much as they used to, and I bet our grandchildren won't even notice them at all. So I think it's a transitional thing there.
Okay, thank you.
I'm talking too much again.
No, that's good. It's good. Susan Wilson, did you want to actually ask your question? Because you're asking about the cost of kilowatts, megawatts of tidal versus onshore wind.
Yeah, thanks, Dominic. It is John here, sat next to
Hi,
Susan.
John.
Thank you, Neil, for the talk. Yeah, I'm curious to know. I mean, the Toad or the mounted turbine that you've got, which is the submarine version.
Mm-hmm.
You know, broadly speaking, I mean, it seemed like it had a colossal output, but how does that compare to onshore wind? Because I know that I could go onto eBay and buy a kit for a 1 kilowatt device for, you know, sub £1,000, and, you know, permission aside, that'll be up and running in a few days. Now, this is order of magnitude, but where does it rank?
Yeah, we have to recognise at the moment this is still on the edge of experimental, and it's starting to move into the deployment stage of experimental. So the first machines have been built, they've been proved to work, they're now being made to work better. They'll be and over time they will improve. So at the moment it's expensive. You know, tidal energy is an expensive process, but it is coming down dramatically. And there are two parts to that. One is that the cost of technology comes down the more often you do it. There's a thing called learning rates, which effectively says that if you do something and you then double the number of times you do it, you will get better because you practice. It's what humans do. We practice, we get better. And the cost will come down in that doubling by a certain amount. If you then double the deployment again, it'll come down by about the same amount again. If you double it again, it'll come down by the same amount again. So it could be 3 or 4% or something, or 5 or 10%. But the point is, if you do one machine and then you have to do 2 more, and then 4 more, so that's 7, and then 8 more, so that's 15. And I'm not going to do the maths live on TV. But the point is, the price comes down progressively. And you have to recognize that solar panels and wind turbines, we've now put millions of solar panels out, and that's why the price has been absolutely crushed to percents of single-digit percents of what they cost at the start. So the point is that to get tidal energy down to something that is going to be really competitive, we've got to practice, and we're going to have to do a lot of it. So at the start, it's expensive. Now, at the moment, wind turbine, I don't know what you pay, 4 or 5 pence a kilowatt hour, so so it's £40 a megawatt hour. Tidal is probably 200 at the moment. But the point is, we've only put 3 of these machines of that scale in the water ever. And we need to get down to the hundreds in the water, if not the thousands in the water. And at that point, the cost will come down. And there are some cost trajectories shown of how this could actually be made to happen. So we have to go through research and development to get to research, development, and deployment to get to a point where eventually you've got a product you can pick out of the catalogue. But that takes time. And unfortunately, there isn't a way round simply practice. It's like learning the piano. It's just practice. The only thing I would say is there are a lot of places where electricity is more expensive than the UK. And a lot of island communities around the world are presently on diesel generators. There's thumping away somebody somewhere in the palm trees in the background. And those places, and indeed isolated locations, we were talking to some people in Canada, and they have to fly their diesel fuel in for their work. Now, you know, the cost of that is just ludicrous. So some of those locations we think could actually be the first places that will start to adopt these marine energy technologies, because frankly, it's a damn sight cheaper than the 50 pence a kilowatt hour they're presently paying for electricity, rather than the 5 or 10 pence we're paying. So yeah, it is expensive. The price will come down, but it's only going to come down by practice. And don't let anybody tell you anything else.
Thank you, Neil.
Was that
Great
okay?
talk, and I'll let you crack on with the other questions you've got to load in there. Thank you.
Thank you. So there's one from Chris McGrath. So he's been in Orkney for 6 years, and then 10 years ago, mostly doing Neolithic archaeology. And he saw your presentation at Science Week, and he wants to know whether the large connector cable to Scotland is now in.
No. So there were. So the islands are on a couple of connectors to the north coast of mainland Scotland. They were built originally to take a small amount of power to the islands, because the national grid effectively was based on dig coal out of the ground, take it to the pit head, burn it, turn it into electricity, send it on a wire, and disperse it. That was the model. So over time, that then changed a bit, and a big cable was laid up the middle of Scotland, principally to service Dounreay, the nuclear station. And then they basically put an extension lead across the Pentland Firth to us, which is about another 10 miles. So we're on the end of a couple of thin cables. So we can generate, we could receive about 30 megawatts on each of these two cables. So now, because we're generating so much, we've turned it around and we're pushing the power away down those same cables. So we're now able to push about 60 megawatts of power out of the islands rather than pull it in. So there was a proposal for putting in a couple of 100 megawatts of cable. That then stalled. There's been another proposal for putting in a 200 megawatt cable, and that's been approved by Ofgem. Been approved by Ofgem for SSE to invest the money, our money, to do that. But they need to have enough generation signed up to make it work. And so at the moment, we're waiting to see whether that cable is going to get approval. And if it does, there'll be another 200 megawatts of generating capacity. There's also a little irony, if I can just share with you, in terms of be careful what you wish for in life, because that will involve something like a 15-acre substation that will be required, and it's going to be built in the field next to my house. That'll be lovely, won't it? Aren't I lucky? Never mind. So that's just you say be careful what you wish for. The point is, however, that we're also now seeing that there are some other opportunities in the form of not just necessarily pushing the electricity away on a cable. We might need to do other things with it, and methanol the production of hydrogen, and particularly the production of hydrogen-based fuels, so producing ammonia, which you can burn, or methanol, or various other liquid fuels from hydrogen. We might end up exporting those liquid fuels rather than necessarily a cable. So these are all things that are in debate here at the moment, as working out what's going on. So okay, Chris. I hope you enjoyed the archaeology. We're still here, by the way.
Yeah, it's still going with Nick.
It was Neolithic. It was now 6 years older than it was. So.
Thank you for that. Anna Holliman is asking whether the Orkney Islands are also looking at reducing energy demand, so not just generating but reducing.
Yeah. So one of the objectives of the Renewable Energy Association, or Renewable Energy Association, is for including energy efficiency. So. This works on two levels. One is that the cheapest form of energy is the stuff you don't ever have to buy. So if you can be more efficient in what you're doing, then that is clearly a thing to do. From a personal point of view, I'm damned if I'm going to break in my back trying to do all this generating tidal energy if people then let it leak out of rubbish buildings. So that is really important, because we do have, if I quote John Gummer, the chair of the Committee on Climate Change, crap housing in the UK, and basically we need to make better use of the energy. So yeah, that's a big piece of what we're trying to do. Interestingly, we expect we're going to see ourselves using more electricity but less fossil fuels. So the overall energy requirement will reduce, but the overall the electricity produced will increase as we decarbonize and stop burning fossilized black stuff.
Thank you for that. Rachel, were you making a comment, or did you want to ask a question?
No, just a comment.
Okay.
So I've got to ask about this, Rachel. So which Bristol Tidal Power Research Project was that? Was it the marine current turbines?
Sorry, on the 7, I think it was the 80s that he did it. And because at the time we were stopping manufacturing aeroplanes with propellers, and de Havilland Propellers had the expertise. So he put forward paper to the government looking, and they actually did some turbine trials in the 7. And also they were doing, de Havilland's, or Hawkinson Dynamics were doing experiments using the propellers for capturing wind as well. So years later, when he was driving down to Cornwall where they lived, past the imported turbines, always would make a comment about how we had the expertise and let it go.
Rachel, if you have got any papers or anything that refers to that, I'd be really interested, because one of the pictures I showed on the black and white ones was an aero generator, as it was called in those days, that was produced by John Brown Engineering back in the 50s. And I've been reading the case files about that from the archives, and it is so similar to what has nearly been happening with marine energy, in as much as we're teetering on the edge of success, and at which point government then pulls the rug from underneath it. It was your MP that did it the last time, by the way. That's another story, which is not there now. But we absolutely need to learn from our history. So if honestly, if there is any, if you have got anything, or you can have a rummage in the loft or anything, I would be absolutely fascinated.
Well, I can just say to this group that I lent the documents to Barbara Ecklin, and I'm sure she returned them. Then I lent them to someone else, and I don't know who's got it, but it's got all the figures of all the graphs of all the different power in it, typed on an old-fashioned typewriter.
Wow.
So if someone's got a packet in their study that they don't know where it is, it's that, and it's mine. Please return.
I do hope I gave them back to you, Rachel.
I really hope we haven't precipitated a crisis here, so I'm sorry about this.
John Fowler is waving a hand. Do you want to come in on this subject, John?
Not particularly on that one. I was wanting to ask about the Shetland Islands, as to whether you're helping the Shetland Islands at all.
Yeah, a bit. So there's a thing on at the moment called the Islands Deal, which was we had the Prime Minister up, announced it a little while ago, a couple of months ago. And the three island groups, so the Western Isles, Shetland and Orkney, have been working together to try and find ways to push on and make some significant strategic investments that would allow decarbonisation to take place. Shetland's got a bigger challenge than we have, because of course they've got the Sullom Voe oil terminal there, and their uses are quite different. So there's a lot of fishing that goes on there. So that's quite a long range stuff in fairly small boats. So and Shetland has also got some quite strong tides. And there's a company called Nova Energy who've quite successfully put in, I think it's the world's first tidal array, i.e. a cluster of these of small-scale turbines. So they're doing quite well. So we work with them as kindred spirits. They are. They're ploughing their own furrow in their own way, as the Shetlanders do. If anybody knows a shelter, you know what they're like. And similarly, the Orcadians and the Shetlanders are always local rivalry, shall we say? But certainly, everybody's embarked on this same journey, which is, look, we know we're going to have to change, and we either stand there and wait until the lights go out and then scamper around trying to do something in the dark, or we decarbonize now while we've still got some time. And they are very they're active on that. They've also got a good district heating scheme there, working off waste, and in fact the refuse from here gets freighted to Shetland, where it's then burnt and put into a refuse incinerator, which then heats part of Lerwick. So you know, we do work together, but I'm sure there's more we can do together.
Thank you for that. Christina, you wanted to flag up that there was a study carried out for Hastings in 2013-14 about for Upper Wilting Farm, and you were wondering whether any other studies carried out in Rother. Do you just want to come in on that, Christina? Did you want to say any more about that, Christina?
You're on mute. I think still on mute.
Christina, did you want to say more on that?
No. Obviously, I'm relatively new to Rother, so that was the only study that I have come across. It's on land, so that proposal was and on the shore, but that was the only proposal I have come across in Rother. So I just wondered whether the group, as a group, whether you are aware of any other study that was carried out recently.
I mean, one of the challenges just politically is that on land wind turbines have been not supported, and Susan Wilson and John Archer can tell us more about that, because they were hoping to have a wind turbine on their own land, which was, well, we had huge problems with that. So I don't know whether the tide has turned in terms of supporting onshore wind again. Do you know about that, Neil?
Well, it's interesting you say it's not supported, because our experience really bears out that which seems to surface in the opinion polls. So BEIS, the Business Enterprise and Industrial Strategy Department of Business Enterprise and Industrial Strategy, was in the old DTI buildings, if people know it, in 1 Victoria Street. They do an opinion poll survey every quarter, I think. It's called the WAVE survey, and they're up to about wave 32 or wave 33, something like that. And they routinely show nearly high 80% support for renewables in various forms, including onshore wind. So what we tend to find is there's a vociferous minority who seem to have always got a pathological hatred of wind, and that does tend to be very vocal, and they do seem to be very organised. But what we've generally found is it comes to this point about ownership and involvement. So if people feel they have a stake in it and they can see the value of it and they can see how it's benefiting the community in one form or another, then we're not seeing the same sort of opposition. In Orkney, there's a set of 5 turbines that were put up, a place called Hammers Hill. The council took a 20% stake in that wind farm, and that's actually basically supporting services that would otherwise have to be picked up through rates, or more accurately, probably not supported. The council has got 3 applications, or 2 applications in, and 1 that's in pre-consenting at the moment, for big turbines, 140 metre high turbines, I think they are. And generally speaking, people have looked at the photo montages and gone, well, that's all right. There are 1 or 2 people who are vehemently opposed, but the vast majority of people have gone, yeah, and? So I think it's important that you seek to try and maintain a balance in not just the people who are speaking, but also what the views of the people who are not speaking.
Did you want to come in on this?
Just very quickly, I mean, it's the district council, their local plan is becoming out of date, and so they are reviewing, and they're beginning the process now. And this is really the time when groups like this can actually change what's happening in the local plan, which means that things like turbines, wind turbines, whether it's offshore or onshore, the policy could change. And once the policy's changed, off we go.
Thank you.
Just on that as well, we also, you can tell from my ritual Cadian accent, which you probably recognise it's quite similar to Hugh's. We're from Bournemouth, and there there was quite a lot of pushback about offshore wind. And it's quite strange at the moment because there's all this stuff about, it'll spoil the view, but they're quite happy to have some bloody great cruise liners parked in the bay, which the angle at the eye is about 3 times higher than the turbines would have been, and it's different in the bay. And people are going, "Oh, well, that's all right." It's people's reaction to changes in views are really intriguing. I'm so glad I'm an engineer and not a psychologist.
Could just come in on our local turbines at Polegate. When they were going in, when the inquiry was going through on them, the Friends of the Earth in Polegate did a lot of surveying of people actually living within sight of where those turbines were going to go, and came back with a very large majority of the local people in favour of the turbines going in. So we actually go to the trouble of asking people, even here locally, I think we'd find a majority in favour.
So I've just looked at the BEIS survey, which was published in June 2020, and it's showing the proportion of people who supported renewable energy was 80%. Only 2% opposed it. I'll put a link to this and the other surveys. There's quite a lot of summary information that's gone on over the years at different ones, and they're as a group as a series of reports, they're well worth having a look at, because it's very interesting to see where people are, and if you are trying to change things positively in an environmental way, I find it quite inspiring, because you can get worn down by just the negativity sometimes.
Okay, and Mike just pointed out that ammonia is considered an option for zero carbon shipping in future. I mean, obviously, ammonia is used extensively in farming as well. So potentially, is that a big growth area generally?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yes, it's got a couple of options. The main advantage with ammonia is you effectively make it out of air and water. So by splitting the water into hydrogen and oxygen, you keep the hydrogen, and you then split the air. You strip the nitrogen out of the air and throw away the CO2 and the oxygen and stuff, and combine the nitrogen and the hydrogen together with the Haber-Bosch process, and you can produce ammonia. Ammonia has got about 40% the calorific value of diesel, so you can burn it. Chuck Yeager's rocket ship, which is the first one that beat the sound barrier, that was ammonia powered. So you can use it as a rocket fuel, or you can use it in a diesel engine in various forms. So that all works. The big advantage of it is that it stores really easily. You can store it like propane. Now, you can put it in a thin tin can, like a Cala bottle, as opposed to putting it in a very thick wall cylinder, which is what you need to do to storing hydrogen. So the storage of the material becomes easy. If you refrigerate it to about -30, it turns to a liquid, and then you can keep it in a bucket. You know, so as a fuel, it's very portable, or it's a material that you can keep in large quantities quite easily, whereas hydrogen is much more difficult. So I think we're going to see that as a possibility. Now, whether we end up with small-scale on-farm ammonia production processes, which I could see possibly happening, or at a community level, that's possible. Whether it might be better to do it bulk offshore in large offshore wind farms that then produce a liquid and cart the liquid ashore, you know, I think we've got to see where that all goes, really. But it does work. And the same sort of thing happens with methanol. You can take carbon dioxide and hydrogen, combine them, make a hydrocarbon. But if the carbon dioxide has been stripped out of the atmosphere rather than or plant material, you can make hydrocarbon fuels that don't have a climate change effect. So, you know, there are things that can be done once you've got hydrogen, and I strongly suspect we're going to see a lot of this stuff starting to happen in the coming years. Okay. The hydrocarbons are not bad. It's the fact it's fossil carbon that's the problem. That's the principal danger.
Sue Prochak pointed out that in Robertsbridge there's an old Victorian water mill. Is it worth trying to get that restored in terms of energy generation today?
Get an engineer can have a look at the maths, because the energy is quite straightforward. It's mass times gravity times height. So it's the flow rate multiplied by gravity times the flow rate in tons. Well, yeah, units you're working in, but basically tons per second times the height times gravity, and that will give you in megajoules, I think, from recollection. Doing live maths again, I really ought to learn not to do that. But you'll probably find the energy is may actually be quite small. There are some places it's worked. So, for example, in Windsor, they've put Archimedean screw turbines on that'd be the Thames, wouldn't it? And they are generating a reasonable amount of power. You often find these sites might be quite low, but there could be a good number of kilowatts which could run a few houses type stuff, but you won't run the town on it. We have a very energy dense society, and we use a massive amount of energy on a routine basis, and at the moment that's only capable of being produced by hydrocarbons, and we couldn't go back to what we did before of just using the air and water around us. We're going to have to cast our net really wide, and this is why offshore is going to be important, because we're going to have to pull our energy in from a much greater area than the hinterland that we used to use before.
Thank you for that. Philip has said, how are the various renewable generators engineered against increased incidence of extreme weather events?
Carefully, I think would be the answer. So, yeah, I mean, and I suspect there are probably a couple of things going on. One is, we are going to see these increased weather events, and the speed with which they happen is as yet unknown. Most of the renewables we're seeing, like say wind, have probably got a life of 20-25 years, in which case they'll then get repowered, as they call it, and they either stick a bigger turbine on top or put a new bit of kit on. So I would expect the rate of change we might see with weather will match the replacement of the turbine. So we'll just put better and better turbines up as things go on. In terms of we're seeing the turbines get titanically huge, and we're now seeing turbines. Well, I mentioned the large turbine we had here, which is a 3 megawatt turbine back in the 80s. I've just seen a 12 megawatt turbine in the process of being installed, which is simply enormous. The blade height would be something the same or similar to, I think, from recollection, the Gherkin in London. Is that sort of size. These things are getting enormous. Now, those are principally being driven by material science changes. So it's carbon fiber, it's Kevlar, it's the production of the gears and various bits and pieces. So it's a materials based thing. So I think we can actually use the materials for these large turbines, and if the weather gets worse, we simply make the turbines slightly smaller but with the same materials. What does worry me more is the changes which will may be needed. I think agriculture is the main threat. So if we're doing things based around biomass, I genuinely think we're going to see real struggles with some of the our agricultural practices at the moment, because if it's wetter and stormier, we may not be able to get the biomass off the fields. So I'm nervous about that as a renewable solution, to tell you the truth.
Okay, David G, you had your hand up.
Yes, just quickly, the 60% fuel poverty is very high, and what have been the main success stories in getting that down? And secondly, heat pumps. The government's offering £5,000 grant currently to install heat pumps. How viable are they for an ordinary domestic household?
Okay, so I'll do the heat pumps first. Extremely viable, and I would take their hand off if you got the chance. I'm in a heat pump heated house, have been for the last 10 years, works perfectly well. There are two choices of heat pumps, either the ground source heat pump, and that too splits into two. You can either put coils of pipes in the ground, or you can drill a borehole. The borehole ones are probably best overall. Particularly, I would have thought in your geology there, because it's fundamentally a function of water permeation past the borehole that helps the energy flux, and they're silent. I've got an air source heat pump which works perfectly well, but I am in an isolated property, and if this was my neighbour's heat pump, I think the noise would irritate me. But because it's mine, I put up with it. So I think there's the heat pumps do work really well. In terms of performance, our air source heat pump, we get a coefficient performance over 3. So for every kilowatt hour I put in, I get 3 kilowatts of heat out. If that was a ground source heat pump, I'd expect between 4.5 and 5. We've also got a heat pump that's been put in on the harbour locally here that heats a local library. That gets a coefficient performance up to 7, because it's working from a very uniform temperature medium. So the harbour temperature doesn't fluctuate. It just goes from bloody cold to really bloody cold. It doesn't change dramatically. So heat pumps do really work. There is talk about having what they call them, hybrid heat pumps, which also then use gas to give you really high heat at the top. Personally, we are heating our hot water on our heat pump, and it's perfectly all right. So I personally, I'm not seeing the need for that. There's also an awful lot of guff talked about the fact that you have to go and replace all your radiators, and you have to change this and you have to change that. The scale of changes that you need in a house is comparatively small. So and heat pumps are improving, that they are producing higher and higher water temperatures. The efficiency will probably drop off a little bit because it's having to work harder, but thermal efficiency is the first thing. I would strongly suggest a heat pump would work. You do need to make sure you get a heat pump that's big enough to make it work. And if you can, put in some thermal storage while you're at it, because the best thing to do would be to run the heat pump when you're just off peak. Because if you can keep away from peak electricity prices and run it during the night or whatever, store the heat and then use it during the day, it'll save you running your heat pump possibly at peak electrical cost times, and because that can be a bit eye-watering. So
David,
sorry.
There was a second part to your question, wasn't there, David?
Yes, about fuel poverty, the high rate, and what's being done on that, and what's succeeding.
Yeah. There's a lot going on. There's an organisation called THOR, which is I can't remember what it stands for now. Something about affordable heat. and they are trying to help families in fuel poverty, but principally it's less about the fuel, it's more about the poverty. So it is, one of the issues we have here is that we have a longer heating season, and it is more expensive than the rest of it. Plus the wages are lower than the average, and so you have to spend more money on fuel and you've got less money in the first place.
Yeah.
So trying to socially intervene. Sorry, David.
The energy efficiency component helping there might help, might be.
Yes, so there are systematic attacks on the housing and trying to improve it. So social housing is to a high standard, but we've also got quite a lot of old housing, and there's a bit of a thing that people will tend to always want to cling on to the old house, whereas in fact I think we've got to recognise that there was some really rubbish housing built in the past, and we need to draw a line and go, you know what, flatten it, start again. So there are campaigns to try and do things. One of the challenges we do find is that some of the legislation is a bit weird, that you have to be contractors of particular registrations and stuff in order to do things to get certain grants, which is a bit weird because they never check up how well those grants were then spent later on. Whereas it would seem to be better to have a system whereby you had to get to a house to a particular standard and it was then proven at that standard to release the grant. So I think there are some regulations that could help unblock some of the fuel poverty issues. But it is, but things like electric vehicles would really help. An electric vehicle, it costs about a fifth of an internal combustion engine per mile. So if you're doing significant distances to and from work, it's worth having. But if you're only doing very short distances, it's a waste of time. So there are spaces where different interventions will be really useful to help allow people's money to go further.
Okay, thank you. There have been some more questions. Actually, I see, hang on. Chris McGrath has said, we've carefully avoided the EU and Brexit. I think the harbours and ferries have been funded partly by the EU. Do you expect the Scottish Government to match that lost funding? And I suppose also, this is a question from me, in terms of EMEC, the first word stands for European. Do you see any impact for the year to come?
Yeah, we don't know. We genuinely don't know. It's hard not to see it from my end of the telescope as a train smash. So we are not looking forward to Brexit, and indeed Scotland, Orkney was the least in favour of exiting the European Union, with the exception of Gibraltar. And Scotland has voted firmly against leaving the Union, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if there isn't an independence referendum again, and one of the things on the list will be, right, let's go back in then. So so I don't know. So I'm not getting rid of the E from EMEC, from the European Marine Energy side of things, just for the minute. So we'll see what happens. We generally don't know. Europe has been extremely effective at driving a lot of environmental legislation. The Bathing Water Directive, to clean up our beaches and a load of stuff. So I am concerned that we will race towards the bottom with chlorinated chicken and all this sort of stuff. So I am concerned in the environmental space, and in terms of the money side of things, we don't get any grants for what we're doing. We only win projects that we get. So we haven't had any public money as a grant since 2013. So we win our projects, but whether we'll still be allowed to compete within European projects, I think really depends on how the deal goes or not, as the case may be. So it is uncertain. There was a first part of that question. I jumped to the second bit straight away. What was the first bit?
So that was my fault. About Chris, did you want to come in on this about who will fund the ferries, etc.?
Yeah. It's an interesting point, actually. The ferry behind me is one of the 9 ferries. They're all owned by the local council, and there's a big argument, or as it would be known in Scotland, a big stooshy going on between the Scottish Government and the Orkney Islands Council, because all the other ferries in Scotland, pretty much all the other ferries in Scotland, are owned by Caledonian McBray, which is owned by David McBrain Group, which is owned by Scottish Government. So the ferries, most of the ferries are owned by Scottish Government, and they are going to need replacing over time. These are owned by the council, and at the moment, we're not getting any help for doing that from Scottish Government at all. So we are quite keen to push for some projects to do some innovative things with ferries, because there are ferries produced now which have got far better fuel efficiency and indeed are fully electric. So we expect we'll either end up with hydrogen-based ferries or electric-based ferries, which will be cheaper to run, more fuel efficient, and indeed could run faster with probably lower crewing levels, which would make them cheaper to run as well. So we would like to, well, we'll take money from anybody to replace the ferries, because it's basically infrastructure. But it's quite a fight that's on the go at the moment about who's actually going to fund the ferries. But no, we're not seeing European money funding them at all at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that. There's been some really good discussion between Anna and Mike on hydrocarbons, etc. I'm not going to read through all of that, and I also know that Anna sadly had to leave us now. But she was asking, does Orkney have any measure to ask people to reduce energy consumption on low energy days? And she's thinking of the EGS traffic light system.
Yeah, no, we don't. The thing is, if you give people signals to reduce their usage, it only seems to reach the committed or the energy anoraks. People then tend to not pay much attention to it after a fairly short period of time, unless it's much more expensive. So, at a guess, I would suggest that pretty much everybody here is on direct debit. You nod or shake your head, you're on direct debit for your electricity, okay? And do you know exactly how much you pay on your direct debits each month? I'm seeing about half there. And the point is that if because most people don't necessarily know, if you told them they could save half, they think, oh, that's great. But if half is only £1 a day, they quickly get into the, oh, sod it space. So I think a signal-based thing is a problem. I think what we're more likely to see is automation take over and do this in the background. So we're likely to see, for example, I have an electric car. I expect my car, I don't care when my car charges, as long as it's charged in the morning before I go out to work. Well, you remember the days we used to go to work. Anyway, another story. But I think what we will see is that the system will choose when to charge the car, and it will be done at a time that suits the electricity system and me, rather than just me remembering. And I think the same sort of thing will happen with freezers, that they may be off at key parts of the day because the freezer has got sort of thermal inertia. Your hot water system will probably come on and off at various times depending on what's going on. So I suspect probably what we'll see is an automated system. So there will be signals sent to your appliances, but probably not sent to you.
Okay, thank you for that. Christina has pointed out that Rother District Council now falls within the Beachy Head East Marine Conservation Zone. That was designated on the 31st of May 2019. And are there any implications for an offshore wind proposal in an MCZ regarding the technology?
Probably. It depends on the nature of the designation, whether there was a particular species that gave rise to the designation. So, for example, merle, which is a form of coral, is quite big here. Some areas are particularly big on particular marine animals. So, as long as the construction doesn't adversely affect the interests of what drove the conservation area, then it should be possible. So you could imagine you could have a big dolphin population or something like that, and then the act of piling to put in the turbines could be damaging. So there may be a time to do it in the year when the dolphins aren't around type stuff, or there may be some driver. However, the other thing that we need to recognize is that putting in marine sites like this changes the habitat and actually introduces some really interesting habitat, because suddenly you've got structures in the water column which then get colonized by marine life, which then become minor island or vertical islands basically, and that then attracts different wildlife to do different things. And there's some quite good, interesting tracking that I saw was done on some seals in the North Sea. And they basically glued a sort of satellite tracker to the back of these poor seals' heads and let them go. And they swam around and did their thing. And after a while, they noticed them swimming in a grid pattern. And when they overlaid that with the wind turbines, they found that basically the seals were going wind turbine to wind turbine to wind turbine, because that's where the fish were. Because the fish were there because of the reef that had been created as a result of the base of the wind turbine. So, you know, you will change the habitat in some way, but not necessarily for the worse. And one of the questions I think we need to ask ourselves is, what do we want the marine habitat to do? So if we are, for example, short of spawning ground for herring, let's say, why not make the foundations of the wind turbines of the substrate that herring can spawn on? You know, texture it in such a way. Does it need to be a monolithic rocks, or if it was like Swiss cheese, would that be a better way to improve habitat? And we can design this stuff. We're about to go and do some big intervention. Let's do something clever out there. You don't have to do the simple thing, the dumb thing. Just go be clever. Doesn't take more effort.
Good. I see we're coming quite close to 9 o'clock. Neil, one of the things you pointed out to me, but we haven't spoken about this evening, but I find quite interesting, is underwater data centers. Do you want to just talk a bit about that?
Yeah, okay, can do. So yeah, I forgot about that. So we member staff wandered into the office one day and said, I've had this rather weird email. What do you think we should do with it? And it said it was from Microsoft. And it said, hello, this is Microsoft. We'd like to do a project with you. So our first reaction was, do you have any Nigerian princes you want me to exchange bank details with as well? But actually, it wasn't a piece of spam. It was actually Microsoft, and they had contacted us to say that they wanted to do a project. And it transpired it was about putting a data center in. Now, data centers are what run the internet. So big wad of computers doing whatever it is computers do. And there are thousands of these all over the world. They use a huge amount of energy, and something like 50% of the energy in some of these data centers is used for cooling the computer equipment. So they thought, could they do something else? And the idea was, could they put the data centers somewhere cool in the first place to then save having to burn gas to make electricity, to run a refrigeration plant to cool something down with those incumbent inefficiencies. So they thought, could he put it somewhere cool in the first place? So they did an experiment first of all in California, found it worked, the kit worked, so they decided to do another project with us. So they installed a data center, and it worked really well. It was about the size of a shipping container, and I will send a note to it. I'll find the notes for it as we get to something. And the advantage with it was threefold. One, it used no energy for cooling. Secondly, by keeping the data, they want to place the data near people, because the time it takes the signal to go from your computer when you press send to go to the data center to come back to redisplay the image, the shorter that distance, the quicker the refresh is on the screen. And so if they can keep data near people, then that's good. 50% of the population of the world live within 100 kilometers of the ocean. So if you can keep the data in the ocean, it's easy to keep it there because it's cheaper than the real estate of trying to find some block somewhere behind Los Angeles, or trying to find a nice big data farms area in Surrey or something. So that was good. Third thing they found was the kit was more reliable because it was underwater, out of sight, nobody could bump into it, uniform temperature. They purged it with nitrogen so there was no corrosion, and it was 8 times more reliable than the data center on land. And my point is, when you start to innovate, interesting people come and talk to you and ask you to do more. So the act of innovating itself generates innovation. So I once again, if you've got an idea, get out there and try it, and interesting people will beat a path to your door and probably give you other ideas to play with. So I would strongly recommend you grasp any projects you can.
That's a great inspirational note, Neil, to come to an end of our meeting. I just wanted to highlight that the Rother Environmental Group has its AGM on Tuesday, the 24th of November at 7:30. We've got Chris Bentley speaking about garden invertebrates. Anybody who isn't a member of REG, if you want to join REG, you're very welcome. And all members, likewise, if you can make that meeting, that would be great. And anybody wanting to join the committee, committee or just join us as an observer, you're also very welcome. Just get in touch with me or Nigel. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening. Really good turnout, in excess of, well, we've had 36 people here this evening, which is good, and a really interesting talk. Thank you so much again, Neil, and look forward to seeing you all next month then. Thank you ever so much.
Bye all. May see you up in Orkney someday. Bye all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
No problem at all.